Hey, it's time for the main thing now, and sports reporter and author Matt Seeger joined Trey to tell his own incredible conversion story and chronicle the Major League Baseball players of the 1970s, who were, as he calls them, the spiritual pioneers of sharing the gospel as professional athletes. I mean, if you think about that time and then professional sports, I mean, that's kind of crazy that sharing the gospel is happening at all in that scenario. So considering that context and more, this conversation on today's main thing is one you won't want to miss.
You're the author of this book, The God Squad, the born-again San Francisco Giants of 1978. You've spent years studying this, compiling this information. You're also a sports reporter. You were actually saved and became a born-again believer the same year as the subject matter of your book in 1978. So talk a little bit about your own conversion to Christianity.
I'm Jewish. Both my parents are Jewish. I was not raised religiously Jewish, but culturally I knew I was a Jew. One thing I knew as a Jew was we don't believe in Jesus. But when I got to graduate school at Syracuse University to study magazine journalism, I got very sick. I went to the clinic. I got a doctor named Indira Koshi, who was a believer, and shared with me just a little bit about that there was a God who loved me, and then my name was in the New Testament, Matthew, and she showed me the Gospel of Matthew, gave me a little New Testament, and I read it a bit, but I got well and kind of put it aside. But a few years later, I began to get drawn again into reading the Bible I had gone through some personal difficulties, and now I was turning back, looking to see if there was a God. And one night, I was at my home. I was talking to a Jewish friend of mine named Carol. It was around 10 at night. And I said to Carol, I'm beginning to believe in God as I read the Bible. I said, also, for one thing, sometimes things happen I can't explain, like, for example, I'll be thinking about a person I haven't seen in a long time and the phone will ring and it'll be them. I just use that as an example of, things I couldn't explain. But I said, as a Jew, I don't see how I could believe in Jesus. Right after I said that, the phone rang. It's like 10 o'clock at night. I looked at Carol. I said, it's probably God calling, one of those strange phone calls. I picked it up. The guy on the other end says, is Lisa there? I said, no, she moved. Thought he'd hang up. He said, well, she borrowed a book from me. I'm trying to get it back. Oh, I don't see any books here. Sorry, gotta go. He kept talking. He says, well, the other reason I was calling, I wanted to invite her to a lecture on campus by a Jewish believer in Jesus. And he said, and I myself am a Jewish believer in Jesus. And I just about dropped the phone. I'm like, here I'm talking about strange phone calls and Jews believing in Jesus, and who is this guy? So I said, all right, Lisa's not here, but I am. I'll go to this lecture. So I went. I met some other Jews who believe in Jesus, began to go to their Bible study on Saturday morning, began to go to their church. August 6, 1978, our church showed the film A Thief in the Night about the rapture. Scared me to death. After it was over, I turned to my friend Mike Barbalas. I said, Mike, when all this comes down, I want to be on the right side. Just pray with me. And I just prayed that I would be on God's side. And, and the Bible says whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So that's all I knew. That's what I did. And after that, gradually I began to notice a change within me, a transformation that kept going. And that's how I got saved. That's my miracle.
It's good to have you with us here, and it's good to talk to you about the God Squad. And, there are some people who will hear that phrase and they'll immediately know what it is, right? For people who are sports fans, for people who have been following baseball maybe since the 70s, they'll be aware of that term. But for people who are not aware of what the God Squad is, tell us a little bit about that group of people and why that is so pivotal in Major League Baseball and specifically with the San Francisco Giants.
The Jesus Revolution really started in Southern California in the late 60s, early 70s. And young people in particular were getting swept up in the movement and becoming born again believers. And that kind of swept up the coast to Northern California. And it also swept into professional baseball. And there was one fellow in particular, Gary Lavelle, on the Giants, who got saved in winter ball in 1976. And then when he came back to the club in 77, he gradually began to share his faith with teammates, and many of them responded. And by 1978, not purely through Gary Lavelle, but by 78, there were, I count, 11 born-again Christians on a roster of 25 on the Giants. And what happened was in 78, they had a great comeback kind of a year. They had been pretty bad for several years. It was a highly successful season. Often the players would thank God afterward for the abilities he gave them, after the game, post-game interviews. And the press raised no objection because they were winning. So what could they say? But in 79, the Giants got off to a terrible start, and the local media decided to blame the born-again players. They said their faith had made them passive. They didn't care about winning. They just cared about Jesus. And somebody labeled them the God Squad. It was a pejorative. And so that became a theme which actually lasted until 1984 or early 85, by which time all of the God Squad had been traded away. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know.
I'm 32, so I think one of the big things that comes to mind when I think about Christianity and sports overlapping is I think of Tim Tebow, right? That is just the first image that comes to mind. But this is a trend that far preceded Tim Tebow. It's something, as you said, in the 70s was present with the God Squad. Initially, it was something that was meant as a criticism, but became obviously to the people who were on the team a compliment. But talk a little bit about some of the inner workings there with the team, the players who were believers and the players who were not believers. How did they coexist with each other? How did that the faith aspect influence their camaraderie among each other?
There was one antagonistic columnist in particular, Glenn Dickey of the San Francisco Chronicle, who claimed that this was causing division and that the team should trade away some of these God Squatters because they had formed a clique. And there was another columnist named Lowell Cohn who was a satirist and would poke fun at the God Squad, but would not go to that extreme. And when I asked him how he felt about this being a clique, he said, look, players are allowed to hang out with the people that they like. It doesn't make it a clique. It's not a negative thing. And when I talked to Gary Lavelle about was there division, he said, no, not at all. He said they went to dinner with the non-believing players and their wives, and the press had created this story. One of the most ridiculous stories the press created was that there were two team buses when they took the team to the ballpark, one for the born-agains and one for the unbelievers. And it just wasn't true. But stories like that, see, the other thing with this, Trey, was these stories were generated in San Francisco and then picked up by national columnists like Dick Young of the New York Daily News and Peter Gammons of the Boston Globe. And nationally, these falsehoods were spread.
Talk about how maybe some of the societal pressure of the time was playing into how columnists and sports reporters may have been perceiving what the God Squad was actually like.
I think the thing that happened with the God Squad was these guys were not preaching generally. But I think the apprehension in the culture in San Francisco was that these guys were going to be judging the rest of us. There was some trepidation, I think, even among fans and readers, like, well, these guys are holier than thou. The fact is that they weren't. But the thing I want to point out is that the reason this was such a big deal, you mentioned Tim Tebow and others. I feel like the God Squad were spiritual pioneers in that they bore the brunt of criticism because in baseball, a little more history in baseball and Christianity, this was never done. There were, in the 50s and 60s, a handful of ball players who met in just before the games in what became baseball chapel on Sundays. But in terms of speaking out about their faith, it was extremely uncommon. And so when the God Squad did this in of all places, San Francisco, it was, it was like a tinderbox. Something was going to blow. And it did. It was like oil and water. These Christians trying to explain their faith to a culture that just didn't really get it.
Wow, fascinating stuff there. Really interesting. And if you want to see are we getting the full interview up onto YouTube here soon, Trey?
Yeah, we should have the full interview later this week.
All right.
All of it was really fascinating.
Yeah, sure. Looking forward to that for sure. It was fascinating to hear that part of it as well. So, all right, that's going to leave us with time on the pod for one last thing.
We're looking at Ephesians 2:8-9 today. It says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." I think, especially after listening to that main thing there, this verse is a great reminder of the sufficiency of Christ to save us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's not of our own works. No works that you can do are going to save you. Those are a result of our faith, not determinant of our faith. So great message, great verse to marinate on as always. So make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. And Lord willing, that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. God bless. See you then.